He's sold more records than any other Australian artist, and he continues to do so. Current Australian country music seems to me to be somewhat in a state of flux, in the sense that the younger country musicians, say born in the 50s and after, have inherited what they got from Slim, what they got from the more traditional Australian country music exponents.
Kenny Bryan, where are you now? Tell me how you've been. Wish that I could come back to you, still fit in.
But they've also been influenced by a whole parade of musical styles that achieved mass popularity since the mid-50s, particularly including rock and roll.
When we first started playing rock and roll, I think the mums and dads were horrified to see all these people gyrating, and mums and dads just didn't like that at all. They couldn't believe their sons and daughters were participating in something that they weren't involved in, and they couldn't believe that rock and roll can really be exciting. There was Presley and Bill Hale in the Comets, and there was nobody out here. And I think that because Johnny O'Keefe and the DJs were the very first ones, and John was able to not imitate but show the world that we have our own brand of rock and roll, and the kids really picked that up. They really realised that John and the band were equivalent to any overseas entertainment.
Well, I want you to know.
I think John's appeal at the early stage of our careers really was the fact that he was brand new and exciting, and I think the young kids wanted to have their own identity. At those times, there was no one writing Australian music, and there wasn't anybody writing rock and roll at all, and we really just had to listen to overseas records, make our own sound, and hope that we could...
There's no way an Australian band could have put out a hardcore rock or blues album and been taken seriously, because radio didn't play them anyway. They were just hits because of the people. The people bought them, and then radio sort of begrudgingly played a few tracks when it was sort of there with the gold on the wall sort of thing. It was probably a pretty enormous struggle in the 60s, but by the time the 70s rolled round, there was a whole thing going. It was just an exciting period. And the political climate suddenly became favourable to art when the show became a little international in the end, and I think that it became too big for its own good rather than doing what it was doing at its very best. It was exposing Australian talent and showing people that Australia could make hits like anyone else.
Sales for Australian artists over the past year have just skyrocketed. I mean, like, it was unheard of to think that an Australian artist or an Australian group would sell with an album over, say, 20,000 copies. And like Skyhooks have sold over 200,000 copies with Living in the 70s. And it's just, I mean, that's the effect it's had.
And television has been, so far, the only outlet for Australian music. If you watch any of the late-night shows, you'll see Australian clips. Listen to the radio, nothing. People say that the Australian music scene is sick, but it really is just the music being played on radio that's being promoted and manufactured by the recording companies, because it's out of sync with what's actually happening in the underground, so to speak, the roots of music.
I've travelled overseas quite a bit, and the thing that I noticed most was the distinction between that kind of environment and the sort of environments that people look at bands at, you know, in the United States and Europe. And I think there's something quite emotionally very intense about a Friday night at a local pub. You know, if there's a big sweaty crowd and people are drinking lots of beer. I think that's sort of moulded Australian bands in a particular way, and they've developed a certain style that sets them apart from overseas, especially since the early 70s until now. Well, I think I have a healthy suspicion of the American interest in Australia. I think Americans look upon Australia as some sort of new exotic, the land of the noble savage type thing, you know. And I think they see Australian rock and roll in those terms to a degree. But, I mean, it all comes back to, I think for every Australian band that goes over there to tour, it all comes back to, it's a question of self-preservation and just keeping your sights firmly set on your own personal credibility as an artist.
Well, I was looking to see some dreams to rip from your finger.
Australian bands can very easily adopt a more, perhaps a more cynical position as far as trying to break into the American market, which has been the history of a lot of Australian bands who've broken over there, to just adopt, survey these American sound and then just tailor what they do to that. But our band goes back too long, and we've been going too long basically to do that, you know.
Well, it's a tricky thing taking something to the Americans, you know. You wonder what they want. I mean, we see ourselves as just what we are, you know. We don't particularly say, hey, we want to make ourselves more American. But in the same sense, we've never set out to say, hey, we're making a great statement about Australia. I've had an interest in the sort of traditional music of Australia that will come out in a reasonably strong way. I mean, there were a lot of nations that played a part in creating the music of Australia, you know, and I don't think it's fair. A lot of people say, oh, Australian music's just like Irish music, and I know it's not. I've listened to American songs and English songs and European songs ever since I was born, and I've learned a hell of a lot about America and England. I know I could get in the car and drive around America, and every place would really mean something from a song, and that's great, right? But I mean, I would hope that maybe sooner or later people can come to Australia and learn about Australia through the songs of the places.
And if we want to steal your girls, well, that's just what we will do. Because you drove us from your cities and you drove us from your trains. We are down and out in Oyen town.
That people are interested in what's going on, you know, and that a lot of people really do like hearing those stories. And you know, like we played in Horsham one night, and this kid came to me and he said, that song Hungry Is, he said, I played it to my mum, and she's from Oyen, which is where the song's set, and she was just rapt, you know, because she remembers going down the railway yards when she was a kid and seeing all the itinerants come in, you know, so I mean, people are interested in that too.
So won't you spare a smile? Can't you shed a tear in these sad times, in these bad times, in these hungry years?
In 1967, the apartheid system was scrapped, and Aboriginal people were a lot more free to move about in the general society. And it was basically an organisation called CASM, the Centre for Aboriginal Studies and Music in Adelaide, that really developed the first, I suppose, for want of a better term, rock and roll band, Aboriginal rock and roll band, which was No Fixed Address. unique musical form and have, I believe it can go on and have the same sort of influence internationally as reggae music did.
That brand of rock and roll that we did years ago, still accepted, still playing, so I'm still enjoying my music, and I think rock and roll will never die.
I think rock and roll is just the music of the age, and you know, if we sort of like, if we blow ourselves up, that's when it's going to end, I suppose.
Half the youth in the world's trying to say, hey, you guys are wrecking the world, you're going to blow it up with bombs, you're going to control the economy so much that only big business, large money corporations, finance houses and banks are going to survive, and everyone on the streets is going to be walking around with begging bowls. And music's the only lone statement, the lone voice against that.
Special dance, tell me why you're trying to wipe the smile of silver straight.